She wore a veil not to signify purity, but to hide the dark yellowing bruise blooming along her jaw. Gideon, the Duke of Westfall, knew he was buying damaged goods. High society called her the ruined sister, a woman who had carelessly thrown her virtue to the dogs. He married her to satisfy a land debt, expecting a hysterical weeping burden. Instead, he got a woman whose silence was sharper than broken glass. Soon, he would discover the monsters who broke her lived right under his own roof. The chapel smelled of wet wool, old stone, and the sharp, suffocating scent of lilies. Lilies were for funerals. Gideon supposed it was fitting. He stood at the altar with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture military straight, watching the heavy oak doors at the back of the nave. He did not want to be here. He had spent the last 10 years pulling the Westfall dukedom out of the crippling debt his father had left behind. He had rebuilt the tenant farms, he had balanced the ledgers, but to secure his people's future, he needed the deep water port at Blackrock. Lord Richard Hastings owned Blackrock, and Hastings had made a simple, brutal offer. Take my eldest daughter off my hands, take her far away to the country where her shame cannot stain my house, and the port is yours. The heavy doors groaned open. The draft made the altar candles flicker and spit wax onto the flagstones. Lord Hastings entered first, practically dragging the bride by her elbow. Behind them trailed the younger sister, Arabella. She was a vision in pristine peach silk, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Arabella was the golden child, the one currently courted by the prince's cousin. Her reputation had to be protected at all costs. And then there was Genevieve. Gideon narrowed his eyes as she was pulled down the aisle. Society's gossips had painted Genevieve Hastings as a reckless, passionate fool. The story went that she had been caught in a roadside tavern, utterly compromised with a married viscount. They said she wept, begged, and threw things when her father confined her. The woman walking toward him did not look passionate. She looked hollowed out. She wore a gown of pale gray, a dress a few seasons out of fashion, noticeably lacking the embellishments expected of a ducal wedding. Her hands, clutched around a pathetic bouquet of white roses, were gloveless. Her knuckles were white. But it was her face that caught Gideon's attention. She wore a thick mourning veil. Hastings stopped in front of Gideon and released Genevieve's arm with a rough shove. She stumbled forward a half step before catching herself. She did not look at her father. She did not look at Gideon. "Your Grace," Hastings said, his voice dropping into a register meant to convey deep paternal sorrow, though his eyes were hard as flint. "I entrust my greatest tragedy to your care." Gideon didn't reply to the older man. He looked over Hastings's shoulder at Arabella, who stepped forward to fuss with the back of Genevieve's dress. "Oh, Jenny," Arabella whispered loud enough to echo in the damp chapel. "If only you had listened to me. If only you had kept your virtue. But do not fear. His Grace is a merciful man to take you." Arabella reached up to adjust Genevieve's veil. As her perfectly manicured fingers pressed against the side of Genevieve's face, the bride flinched violently. It was a microscopic movement, controlled almost instantly, but Gideon saw it. He saw the way Arabella's smile tightened, a flash of pure malice crossing the younger sister's face before settling back into a mask of pity. The vicar cleared his throat. The ceremony began. It was a cold, transactional affair. Gideon spoke his vows with the precise, clipped tone he used for business negotiations. When it was Genevieve's turn, she hesitated. The silence stretched. Hastings shifted his weight, his boot scraping harshly against the stone. "I do," Genevieve whispered. Her voice was completely devoid of life, sandpaper against dry wood. When it came time for the ring, Gideon reached for her left hand. Her skin was freezing. He expected her hand to be soft, the pampered hand of an earl's daughter. Instead, he felt a distinct callus at the base of her thumb and the faint, jagged line of a fresh scratch across her wrist. He pushed the heavy gold band onto her finger. It was slightly too large. The vicar pronounced them man and wife. There was no kiss. Gideon did not lift the veil. He simply offered her his arm. Genevieve placed her hand on his sleeve. She felt like a bird made of glass. One wrong pressure, and she would shatter. As they turned to walk back down the aisle, Gideon caught Hastings slipping a folded piece of parchment, the deed to Blackrock Port, into the breast pocket of his coat. The bargain was struck. Gideon had his port. He had paid for it with his name, and looking down at the rigid, silent woman beside him, he realized he had no idea what to do with his purchase. The rain began the moment they stepped out of the chapel. It was a cold, driving downpour that turned the London streets into a slurry of mud and horse dung. Gideon's footman held the carriage door open. Hastings stood under the awning of the church, refusing to step out into the weather. He didn't offer his daughter a final embrace. Arabella stood beside him, clutching her father's arm. "Goodbye, sister," Arabella called out. "May God grant you a quiet life of reflection." Genevieve stopped with one foot on the carriage step. She didn't turn around. Her shoulders lifted in a slow, deep breath, holding it for a long second before she let it out. Then, she pulled herself into the dark cab. Gideon followed, rapping his knuckles twice on the roof to signal the driver. The carriage lurched forward. They sat opposite each other. The interior of the coach was entirely shadowed, save for the occasional flash of a passing street lamp. Rain lashed against the small glass windows. For the first 5 miles, neither of them spoke. Gideon took the time to study her. She had finally pushed the heavy veil back over her bonnet. In the dim light, he could see the severe line of her jaw, the sharp cut of her cheekbones. She was not a conventional beauty like Arabella. Her features were too striking, too angular. And then he saw it. Just beneath her left ear, blooming down the side of her throat, was a violent mosaic of purple and yellow. A bruise, heavy, deep, and clearly left by a large hand. Gideon's jaw tightened. He was a cynical man. He believed people were driven by greed and self-preservation, but he drew a hard line at striking women. "I will have my physician look at your neck when we arrive at Westfall," Gideon said. His voice cut through the rhythmic clatter of the wheels. Genevieve didn't jump. She simply turned her head, pulling the collar of her gray coat up slightly. "That will not be necessary, Your Grace. It is healing." "Did your father do it?" "I fell." The lie came automatically, flat, rehearsed. Gideon leaned back against the leather squabs. "Let us establish some ground rules, madam. We are bound by a legal contract, nothing more. I needed your father's port to save my tenant farms. He needed you exiled to save his family's reputation. I do not care about the Viscount. I do not care about the scandal. In Westfall, you will have the run of the manor. You will be clothed, fed, and protected. In return, I ask only that you do not bring further chaos to my doorstep." He expected tears. He expected a defensive tirade about how the Viscount had tricked her, or how she was the victim of passion. Instead, Genevieve met his gaze. Her eyes, he noticed for the first time, were a stark, piercing gray. "I understand," she said. "I require no society. I will not host dinners. I will stay out of your way." She paused, her eyes drifting toward the rain-slicked window. "And I will not embarrass you. I'm well practiced in disappearing." The utter lack of fight in her unsettled him. It was unnatural. The journey to Westfall Abbey took 6 grueling hours. When the carriage finally crunched onto the gravel drive of the estate, it was well past dark. The abbey loomed against the night sky, a massive, sprawling structure of gray stone and ivy. It was imposing, bordering on gloomy. Mrs. Croft, the housekeeper, stood at the top of the steps with a line of half-asleep servants. Gideon stepped out first, ignoring the footman's umbrella, and turned to offer Genevieve his hand. She took it, her steps heavy. She looked exhausted, swaying slightly as her boots hit the gravel. "Mrs. Croft," Gideon said as they ascended the steps, "this is the Duchess. Have her things taken to the East Wing." "Her things, Your Grace?" Mrs. Croft looked out toward the carriage. The footman was unstrapping a single battered leather trunk from the rear boot. That was it. One trunk for a duke's wife. Gideon felt a flare of pure anger. Hastings hadn't just exiled her, he had discarded her like rubbish. Genevieve seemed to notice the awkward silence. "I packed lightly," she said to the housekeeper, her tone polite but detached. "Could you show me to my rooms?" Of course, Your Grace. Right this way." Genevieve followed the housekeeper into the grand foyer. She didn't look at the vaulted ceilings, the tapestries, or the sweeping staircase. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs and turned back to Gideon. "Your Grace," she called out softly. Gideon handed his wet coat to a butler and turned. "Yes?" "The door to my chambers," Genevieve said, her voice dropping lower, stripping away the polite veneer. "Does it have a lock?" Gideon frowned. "A lock?" "It's a heavy oak door, madam, but no, the interior bedrooms do not lock from the inside." A flicker of genuine panic, the first real emotion he had seen from her all day, crossed her face. She masked it quickly, swallowing hard. "I see, thank you. Good night." She turned and practically fled up the stairs. Gideon stood in the hall, staring up at the empty landing. The rumor said she was a wild, debauched woman who sneaked out to taverns for illicit trysts. So why was a woman who supposedly thrived on reckless freedom terrified of sleeping in a room without a lock? It was 3 a.m. Gideon sat in the massive leather chair of his library, a glass of amber scotch resting untouched on the mahogany desk. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing red embers, casting long, wavering shadows against the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Spread out before him were the ledgers for Blackrock Port, and beneath them, the marriage contract. He had read them 3 times. It was a flawless victory for his estate. The tariffs alone would cover the winter feed for the tenant farmers. So why was he grinding his teeth? His mind kept returning to the east wing, to the single, battered trunk, to the bruise, to the question about the lock. He had spent the evening interrogating his own assumptions. High society thrived on ruin. A dropped handkerchief, a lingering dance, an intercepted letter. Any of these could spell social death. But Genevieve's ruin was catastrophic. Caught in a bedchamber at the Prancing Fox Tavern with Viscount Thorne. Or was it Viscount Linfield? No, Thomas Linfield, a notorious rake, married with a vicious temper. The story was that Linfield's wife had hired men to follow him, kicking down the door to find Genevieve Hastings, half-dressed in his arms. Gideon rubbed his temples. It didn't fit. Women who threw away everything for a torrid affair usually possessed a certain defiance. Genevieve acted like a prisoner of war who had just been transferred to a new, slightly cleaner cell. The faint creak of a floorboard out in the corridor pulled him from his thoughts. Gideon remained still. The library door was ajar. A moment later, a figure slipped into the room. It was Genevieve. She wore a heavy woolen wrapper over a plain cotton nightgown. Her bare feet made no sound on the Persian rug. She carried a single unlit candle. She hadn't noticed him sitting in the high-backed chair in the deep shadows of the room. She moved straight to the hearth, kneeling on the stones. She picked up a wrought iron poker and gently shifted the embers, trying to catch a spark on the wick of her candle. Her movements were jerky, tight. She kept looking over her shoulder toward the dark hallway. "If you need light, there are matches in the top drawer of the desk," Gideon said. Genevieve gasped, dropping the poker. It hit the stone hearth with a loud, ringing clatter. She spun around, pressing her back against the mantelpiece, her chest heaving. The sheer terror in her eyes made Gideon's stomach twist. She looked like she expected him to strike her. "I apologize," Gideon said quietly, keeping his voice low and even. He didn't stand up. He knew better than to loom over a cornered animal. "I didn't mean to startle you. I often work late." Genevieve pressed a hand to her chest, trying to slow her breathing. I couldn't sleep. The house is very dark. I just wanted a candle for my room. Take the one from my desk." She hesitated, then stepped forward, keeping a wide berth between them. As she reached into the candlelight pooling on the desk, the sleeve of her wrapper fell back. Gideon saw her forearm. He reached out, his hand snapping over her wrist. He didn't squeeze, but his grip was firm enough to stop her from pulling away. Genevieve froze, her entire body going rigid. She didn't scream. She just stopped breathing, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the pain. Gideon stared at her arm. Above the jagged scratch on her wrist, her forearm was marred by a ring of dark, finger-shaped bruises. They were older than the mark on her jaw, fading to a sickly yellow-green. Someone had dragged her violently. "Who did this?" Gideon asked. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Let me go," she whispered, her eyes still squeezed shut. Gideon released her instantly. He leaned back in his chair, putting distance between them. "I'm not going to hurt you, Genevieve. Look at me." She opened her eyes. They were shining, but no tears fell. "I asked you a question in the carriage," Gideon continued, his voice dangerously calm. "I asked if your father struck you. You said you fell. A fall does not leave fingerprints on an arm. Did Linfield do this to you?" Genevieve let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. It was a bitter, broken noise. "Linfield? The Viscount, the man you ruined yourself for." Genevieve looked at him, and for the first time, the dead, hollow look in her eyes was replaced by a spark of pure, agonizing rage. "I have never spoken a single word to Viscount Linfield in my entire life." Gideon frowned, confusion cutting through his anger. "What are you talking about? The entire ton knows the story. You were found in his rooms at the Prancing Fox." "I was put in his rooms," Genevieve snapped, her voice trembling. "I was drugged at my sister's birthday masquerade. I drank a glass of lemonade, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up in a foul-smelling bed above a tavern, unable to move my legs. Someone tore the bodice of my gown, and then the door was kicked open by 5 witnesses, including my father." Gideon stared at her. The silence in the library was absolute, save for the crackle of a dying ember. "You were framed," Gideon stated. It wasn't a question. "Does it matter?" Genevieve asked bitterly, wrapping her arms around her stomach as if she were physically holding herself together. "The scandal was out by morning. Linfield claimed I seduced him to save his own neck from his wife's wrath. My father locked me in the attic for 3 weeks. He told me I was poison, a whore. He hit me when I tried to scream the truth from the window. He needed me gone." Gideon's mind raced, piecing together the political chessboard of London society. "Why?" he asked, standing up. "Why go to such elaborate lengths to destroy you? If a man wanted you ruined, there are simpler ways. This was theatrical. This was designed for maximum exposure." Genevieve looked down at her bare feet. "Because Arabella is courting the prince's cousin. A royal match. And I'm the eldest," Genevieve said, her voice dropping to a hollow whisper. "Under my mother's marriage settlements, the eldest daughter inherits the unentailed fortune, £60,000. But if the eldest daughter is legally disgraced or disowned due to extreme moral failing, the money defaults to the second daughter." Gideon stopped dead. £60,000, enough to bribe a viscount, enough to drug a drink, enough for a father, blinded by the prospect of a royal duke for a son-in-law, to look the other way while his eldest daughter was thrown to the wolves. "Your sister," Gideon said, the realization settling over him like a suffocating blanket. "Arabella orchestrated it." Genevieve finally looked at him. A single tear broke free, tracking down her cheek and cutting through the pale, bruised skin. "She handed me the lemonade herself." Gideon looked at the woman he had married. He had thought he was buying a problem to solve a debt. Instead, he had bought a casualty of a vicious, quiet war. He walked around the desk. Genevieve flinched slightly as he approached, but he didn't reach for her. He walked past her toward the heavy oak doors of the library. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice trembling. Gideon paused in the doorway. He looked back over his shoulder, the cynical mask he had worn for 10 years completely gone, replaced by something cold, sharp, and brutally violent. "To find a locksmith," Gideon said softly. "Lock your door tonight, Genevieve. Tomorrow I'm going to teach you how to ruin them back." Mr. Cobble smelled of pipe tobacco and damp iron. He was a broad-shouldered estate carpenter with dirt permanently wedged beneath his fingernails. He did not ask questions when the Duke of Westfall ordered him to hollow out the heavy oak door of the Duchess's bedchamber and install a deadbolt thick enough to secure a bank vault. Genevieve sat in the armchair by the window, watching. She held a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. She tracked Cobble's every movement, the rasp of the file against the brass plate, the shower of pale wood shavings falling to the Persian rug, the meticulous turning of the screws. Gideon stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed, watching the corridor. He had cleared the servants from the east wing for the morning. "Try it," Gideon said when the carpenter packed away his tools and bowed his way out. Genevieve set her cup down. Her hands were still shaking slightly. It was a residual tremor, an involuntary reaction to being awake in the daylight after weeks of hiding in shadowed rooms. She walked to the heavy door. She gripped the brass knob and pulled the door shut. The silence in the room changed. It was no longer the heavy, expectant silence of a trap. It was just a room. She reached for the bolt. The brass was cold. She pushed it to the right. It slid home with a heavy, definitive thunk. The sound reverberated in her chest. She grabbed the handle and yanked backward. The door held fast. The frame didn't even rattle. Genevieve rested her forehead against the cool wood. She closed her eyes. For the first time since she'd woken up in that foul tavern bed, her lungs expanded fully. The tight, crushing band around her ribs snapped. "Better?" Gideon's voice came from the other side of the room. It wasn't soft, but it lacked its usual sharp edge. She turned around. "Yes. Good. Now put your shoes on and come downstairs to the library." Gideon walked toward the connecting door that led to his own chambers. "We have work to do." Genevieve expected him to leave her alone to recover. That was what society expected of women who had endured a shock, confinement, smelling salts, and endless hours of needlepoint. Gideon offered none of that. When she entered the library 20 minutes later, he had cleared the massive mahogany desk. In the center sat 3 thick leather-bound ledgers. The fire was roaring, driving the winter chill from the room. "Sit," Gideon ordered, pulling out the chair opposite his own. Genevieve sat. The leather was worn and comfortable. "If Arabella framed you," Gideon began, leaning forward and planting his hands on the desk, "she did not do it with her own allowance. Drugging a peer's daughter, bribing a viscount, paying off tavern keepers, and ensuring 5 witnesses arrive at the precise moment a door's kicked in requires a vast amount of capital. £60,000 is a motive. It is also a weapon." Genevieve stared at the books. "I do not understand numbers, Your Grace. My name is Gideon, and you will learn." He pushed the first ledger toward her. "Tears will not undo what happened to you. Hysteria will not restore your reputation. The only thing that moves the aristocracy is leverage. You want to ruin them? We follow the money." He spent the next 4 hours teaching her to read the estate accounts. He did not coddle her. When she failed to understand the difference between a liquid asset and an entailed trust, he explained it again, his voice flat and patient. Genevieve leaned into the work. The numbers were absolute. They did not lie. They did not spread rumors. A column of ink either balanced or it didn't. It was a brutal, beautiful logic. As the days turned into weeks, a quiet routine settled over Westfall Abbey. Genevieve spent her mornings with Gideon in the library. They ate their meals in the informal dining room, surrounded by piles of correspondence. The servants stopped whispering. The Duchess was no longer a weeping ghost. She was a fixture, usually found with ink stains on her fingers and a severe frown line between her brows. The bruise on her jaw faded from yellow to a pale, indistinct shadow. The scratches on her arm healed into thin white lines, and the hollow look in her eyes was slowly replaced by something infinitely more dangerous. Focus. On a rainy Tuesday in late November, Gideon's private solicitor, a small bird-like man named Finch, arrived from London. He carried a battered leather satchel and looked distinctly nervous. "I have the inquiries you requested, Your Grace," Finch said, taking a seat in the library. He glanced nervously at Genevieve, who was reviewing the winter wheat yields at the corner table. "Are you certain Her Grace should be present for this?" Gideon didn't look up from his correspondence. "Her Grace is the one who directed the inquiry, Finch. Speak." Finch cleared his throat, opening his satchel. "Thomas Linfield, Viscount. As you suspected, his finances were in ruins. He owed nearly £8,000 to a syndicate in Covent Garden. They were threatening to break his legs, but 3 days after the incident at the Prancing Fox, he paid it off," Genevieve said quietly. She didn't turn around. Her quills scratched evenly against the parchment. "In full," Finch confirmed, wiping his brow. "Paid with anonymous bank drafts drawn from the Royal Exchange. But bank drafts, no matter how anonymous, carry serial numbers." Gideon finally stopped writing. He looked at Finch. "And The drafts were purchased by a Mr. Horace Gadsby, Finch said, pulling out a thin sheet of paper. Genevieve's quill snapped. The sharp crack echoed in the silent room. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floorboards. She walked over to the main desk, her face entirely devoid of color. Gadsby, she repeated. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. You know him? Gideon asked, his eyes locked on her face. He is my father's primary man of business, Genevieve said. Her voice was remarkably steady, though her hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides. Arabella did not act alone. My father funded my destruction. Gideon sat back in his chair. The pieces clicked together with sickening precision. Hastings hadn't just looked the other way. He'd paid for the wood, built the scaffold, and tied the noose around his own daughter's neck to secure the remaining fortune and buy a royal son-in-law. Finch, Gideon said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. I want you to buy up every remaining debt Viscount Linfield holds. Do not use my name. Use shell companies, but buy it all. By the end of the month, I want to own the man. Finch swallowed hard, nodding quickly. Yes, Your Grace. Genevieve looked at Gideon. The cynical, cold duke she had married in that drafty chapel was gone. In his place was a man sharpening a blade, preparing to hand it to her. The trap was sprung in the dead of winter. Snow lay a foot deep across the Westfall estate, blanketing the grounds in a suffocating white silence. The roads were virtually impassable, making isolation absolute. It was the perfect environment for an ambush. Viscount Linfield arrived at Westfall Abbey under the impression he was finalizing a lucrative sale. Gideon had sent an intermediary, a fictional horse breeder, offering an absurdly high price for Linfield's prized Andalusian stallion. Linfield, entirely broke once again despite his payoff, had ridden 2 days through the freezing sleet to secure the funds. He was ushered into the grand library by the butler. The room was dim, lit only by a roaring fire and 2 oil lamps on the vast mahogany desk. Your Grace, Linfield said, brushing snow from his greatcoat. He was a handsome man in a predatory way, sharp features, a practiced smile, and eyes that constantly darted around the room, assessing value. I was told I was meeting a Mr. Harrison regarding my stallion. Mr. Harrison does not exist, Linfield, Gideon said, stepping out from the shadows near the bookshelves. He wore a dark riding coat, looking more like a highwayman than a duke. I bought your remaining debts 3 weeks ago. You owe me £12,000. Payable immediately. Linfield's practiced smile vanished. He took a step back toward the heavy double doors. What is the meaning of this, Westfall? You cannot summon me here under false pretenses. I will have the magistrate. You will have nothing, a voice interrupted. The high-backed leather chair behind the desk slowly swiveled around. Genevieve sat there. She wore a day dress of deep, rich burgundy wool. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, immaculate knot. She rested her elbows on the desk, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. She did not look away as Linfield's face drained of blood. You, Linfield breathed, his eyes wide. Hello, Thomas, Genevieve said. Her voice was smooth, carrying the polished, lethal edge of her aristocratic upbringing. We finally meet properly. I believe the last time we were in the same room, I was unconscious, and you were busy tearing the lace from my bodice for an audience. Linfield looked wildly between Genevieve and Gideon. This is an outrage. I do not have to listen to the ravings of a disgraced... Gideon moved. He was terrifyingly fast for a man of his size. In 3 strides, he crossed the room, grabbed Linfield by the lapels of his sodden greatcoat, and slammed him against the oak paneling. The impact rattled the framed hunting prints on the wall. The Duchess is speaking to you, Gideon said softly, his forearm pressing against Linfield's throat just enough to restrict his air. You will listen, or I will bury you in debtor's prison before the snow melts. Do we understand one another? Linfield choked out a panicked wheeze, nodding frantically. Gideon released him, stepping back but remaining close enough to cast a long shadow over the Viscount. Linfield sagged against the wall, coughing and rubbing his neck. Genevieve picked up a piece of parchment from the desk. It was heavy, legal vellum. I have spent the last 2 months reviewing my father's accounts, Linfield, Genevieve said, her tone conversational. Mr. Gadsby was careless. He left a paper trail, £8,000, withdrawn and transferred to a gambling hell in Covent Garden. It saved you from having your hands broken. In exchange, you played the part of the tragic, seduced victim. They forced me! Linfield spat, his bravado crumbling into desperate self-preservation. Hastings came to me. He knew about my debts. He said he would ruin me if I didn't participate. I had no choice. There is always a choice, Genevieve replied coldly. You chose a woman's life over your pride. She stood up, walking slowly around the desk. She stopped a few feet from him. Linfield flinched. He looked pathetic. A weak, cornered rat. Genevieve realized, with a strange sense of detachment, that she was no longer afraid of this man. The monster of her nightmares was just a pathetic degenerate in a wet coat. I want the truth, Genevieve demanded. Who placed me in your room? Linfield swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Gideon, then back to her. It was the sister, Arabella. She brought you up the back stairs with the help of a footman. You were practically dead on your feet. She threw you on the bed. She was the one who ripped your dress. I just stood there. Then Hastings came up an hour later and kicked the door in. Genevieve closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. Hearing it confirmed, spoken aloud by a third party, solidified the cold stone in her chest. Arabella's hands on her dress, tearing the fabric, setting the stage for her execution. Sign the parchment, Genevieve said, pointing to the desk. What is it? Linfield rasped. A full witness confession, Gideon answered, detailing Lord Hastings's bribe, Arabella's involvement, and your own complicity in the framing of Genevieve Hastings. If I sign that, I am ruined, Linfield cried. Hastings will destroy me. The Ton will exile me. If you do not sign it, Gideon said, pulling a thick stack of promissory notes from his coat pocket and tossing them onto the floor at Linfield's feet, I will call in these debts tomorrow. Your estates will be seized. Your wife will be thrown into the street. You will rot in the Fleet Prison, and I will personally pay the guards to ensure your stay is remarkably unpleasant. Linfield stared at the notes on the floor. His hands shook violently. He looked at Genevieve, searching for a shred of the weeping, ruined girl from the tavern. He found only ice. He staggered to the desk, picked up the quill with a trembling hand, and signed his name at the bottom of the vellum. Gideon stepped forward, sprinkled sand over the ink, and carefully folded the document. He slipped it into his breast pocket. You may go, Lord Linfield. If you ever speak my wife's name again, I will have your tongue cut out. Linfield didn't wait. He bolted from the library, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind him. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't oppressive. It felt like the air after a violent thunderstorm, clear, sharp. Genevieve stood by the desk, her hand resting on the polished wood. She was breathing evenly, but her knuckles were white. Gideon poured 2 glasses of scotch from the crystal decanter on the side table. He walked over and handed her one. She took it, the amber liquid splashing slightly against the glass. He was so small, Genevieve whispered, staring at the door. I spent months thinking of him as a monster, but he is just a coward. Most monsters are, Gideon said, taking a sip of his drink. He looked at her. Her spine was straight. The fearful, broken bird he had married was entirely gone. You did well. You didn't flinch. Genevieve finally looked at him. I didn't have to. You were standing right there. It was a simple statement, but it hung in the air between them, a silent acknowledgement of the shift. Gideon wasn't just her warden anymore. He was her weapon, and she was learning how to wield him. February brought a brief thaw to the countryside, turning the snow to gray slush. It also brought the post. Genevieve was in the morning room, cataloging the spring seed orders for the tenant farmers. She had taken over the estate management with a ferocious efficiency. It kept her mind sharp. It kept the memories of the attic at bay. The butler, Mr. Carson, entered carrying a silver salver. Resting in the center was a thick cream-colored envelope, sealed with a massive blob of gold wax. It bore the Hastings family crest. From London, Your Grace, Carson murmured, bowing slightly before exiting. Genevieve stared at the letter. She didn't touch it. It felt radioactive. Gideon walked into the room a moment later, pulling off his riding gloves. He stopped when he saw her frozen posture. He looked at the salver, then back to her. He walked over, picked up a silver letter opener, and sliced the envelope open. He pulled out a heavy piece of cardstock, scanning the elegant, looping calligraphy. His jaw tightened. A muscle feathered in his cheek. "Read it," Genevieve said quietly. Gideon tossed the card onto the table in front of her. "It is a formal announcement. Arabella is to marry Lord Henry, the Duke of Cumberland's nephew. The betrothal ball is to be held in 3 weeks at the Hastings townhouse in Mayfair." Genevieve looked down at the gold lettering. "Lord and Lady Hastings request the honor of your presence." It is a formality," Gideon said, his voice hard. "Protocol dictates they must send an invitation to the Duke of Westphal. They assume I will decline to save myself the embarrassment of bringing my ruined wife to society. They assume you are hiding in the country, too ashamed to show your face." Genevieve reached out and traced the raised gold lettering of Arabella's name. Arabella had won. She had destroyed her sister, stolen her inheritance, and bought her royal prince. She was about to be crowned the jewel of the season, surrounded by sycophants and admirers, playing the role of the virtuous, innocent younger sister. "They think I am broken," Genevieve whispered. "Are you?" Gideon asked. It was a dangerous question. He wasn't asking to comfort her. He was challenging her. He was asking if the months of ledgers, the installation of the lock, the confrontation with Linfield, if any of it had forged real steel in her spine, or if she was still the girl crying in the dark. Genevieve looked up from the invitation. She met Gideon's eyes. No. Gideon smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory expression. "Good, because I have a port to run, and I cannot abide unfinished business." He tapped the invitation. "We have the confession. We have the bank records. But dragging a Viscount and an Earl through the magistrate's court will take years. The courts protect their own. If you want to destroy them, you do not do it in the shadows. You do it where it hurts them the most." "In front of the entire ton," Genevieve finished, her heart beginning to pound against her ribs, not with fear, with adrenaline. "Precisely." Gideon leaned against the table. "But if we walk into that ballroom, there is no turning back. They will stare. They will whisper. They will try to tear you down before you even reach the dais. Can you withstand it?" Genevieve stood up. She walked to the large gilded mirror hanging above the fireplace. She looked at her reflection. The hollow, terrified girl from the chapel was dead. The woman looking back at her had sharp eyes and an unyielding jawline. The skin of her neck was pristine, unblemished, swept clean of the violent marks her father had left behind. "They think I am a ghost," Genevieve said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, cold resolve. "Let us haunt them." The next 3 weeks were a blur of meticulous preparation. Gideon wrote letters to his political allies. He called in favors. He secured a private townhouse in Mayfair, refusing to stay at his usual hotel. But Genevieve had her own war to prepare for. She summoned Madame Delacroix, the most exclusive and discreet modiste in London, to Westphal Abbey. Madame Delacroix arrived expecting to dress a disgraced country wife in muted, apologetic colors, pale pinks, dull grays, the uniforms of the ashamed. "No," Genevieve told the astonished dressmaker, standing in the center of her fitting room. She tossed aside a bolt of lavender silk. "I am not asking for forgiveness, madame. I am declaring war. I want something that commands the room the moment I step into it." She chose midnight blue velvet. It was a heavy, rich fabric, absorbing the light. The cut was scandalous not in its exposure, but in its severity. It featured a high, structured neckline that framed her face like a portrait, long, fitted sleeves, and a sweeping train that required no hoops. It was the armor of a queen, not the dress of a debutante. When the day finally arrived to leave for London, the air at Westphal was electric. The servants, who had grown fiercely protective of their new duchess, lined the driveway to see them off. Gideon stood by the carriage. He wore impeccably tailored black evening wear, his cravat a stark white contrast. He watched as Genevieve descended the stone steps of the abbey. She wore a heavy traveling cloak over her traveling gown, her posture flawless. She carried a small leather satchel containing Linfield's signed confession and Finch's financial reports. It was a bomb waiting to be detonated. Gideon offered his hand. Genevieve placed hers in his. Her grip was firm. "Are you ready, Your Grace?" Gideon asked softly as she stepped up into the carriage. Genevieve settled into the leather seat, pulling the heavy velvet curtains back to look at the sprawling estate she had come to as a prisoner and was leaving as a commander. "Drive, Gideon," she said. "Let us go ruin my sister." The Hastings townhouse in Mayfair blazed with 1,000 wax candles, spilling yellow light onto the damp cobblestones of the street. Carriages lined the square, gridlocked in a display of immense wealth. The muffled strains of a string quartet drifted through the tall, leaded glass windows. Inside, London society was celebrating the triumph of Arabella Hastings. Genevieve sat perfectly still in the darkness of the Westfall carriage, watching the footmen scurry to open doors for dukes, earls, and viscounts. Her hands rested lightly in her lap. She wore no gloves. She wanted them to see the faint silvery scar on her wrist. She wanted them to look at her and know she had survived the fire they built for her. Gideon sat across from her. He checked his pocket watch, the gold casing clicking shut with a sharp metallic snap. "It is midnight," he said. "The supper rooms will be opening soon. The ballroom will be at its fullest." "Perfect," Genevieve murmured. Gideon knocked on the roof. The carriage jerked forward, pulling into the Hastings driveway. When the footmen opened their door, the noise of the street washed over them. The stamping of hooves, the shouts of drivers, the laughter of arriving guests. Gideon stepped out first. He turned and offered his hand. Genevieve took it. She stepped down onto the pavement. The midnight blue velvet of her gown caught the ambient light, drinking it in rather than reflecting it. It was a heavy, serious dress. The train swept the damp stones, uncaring. Madame Delacroix had woven a subtle net of silver threading through the bodice, giving Genevieve the appearance of a storm cloud edged in lightning. She wore no tiara, no diamonds, no pearls. Her stark, angular beauty was the only ornament she carried. They walked up the wide stone steps. The footman at the door, recognizing Gideon, bowed low. But as they registered the woman on his arm, their eyes widened. One of them actually stumbled backward a half step. They crossed the threshold into the grand foyer. The air was thick with the scent of crushed roses and expensive French perfumes. At the top of the sweeping marble staircase stood the major domo, a heavy silver staff in his hand, loudly announcing the arrivals to the ballroom beyond. Genevieve did not hesitate. She placed her hand on Gideon's forearm. He covered her fingers with his own, pressing them tightly. A silent transfer of strength. They ascended the stairs. The major domo looked down at them as they approached the landing. His mouth opened, closed, and opened again. He looked utterly terrified. He recognized the ruined daughter. He knew the strict orders Lord Hastings had given regarding her exile, but he was also staring into the flat, murderous eyes of the Duke of Westfall. "Announce us," Gideon said. The command was spoken quietly, but it carried the weight of an executioner's axe. The major domo struck his staff against the marble floor. The sharp crack echoed into the cavernous ballroom. "His Grace, the Duke of Westfall," the major domo called out, his voice shaking slightly. "And Her Grace, the Duchess of Westfall." The string quartet, perched on a raised balcony, hit a discordant screech as the first violinist lost his bowing rhythm. The music sputtered and died. The silence that followed was not merely quiet. It was a physical force. It rolled across the massive room, extinguishing the laughter, halting the dancers mid-step, and freezing the gossips behind their feathered fans. 300 of the most powerful people in England turned to face the arched double doors. Genevieve stepped into the light. The crowd parted. It was an involuntary, collective flinch. They moved back, clearing a wide path down the center of the parquet floor, creating an aisle that led directly to the raised dais at the far end of the room. On that dais stood her family. Arabella wore a gown of spun gold and white organza, a delicate diamond tiara resting in her blonde curls. She looked like a fairy tale princess. Beside her stood Lord Henry, the Duke of Cumberland's nephew, looking handsome and entirely confused by the sudden deathly silence in the room. And flanking them was Lord Hastings, his chest puffed out in a military coat covered in ceremonial medals. Hastings' face drained of color, then rapidly flooded with a deep, furious crimson. Arabella's smile froze, turning into a rigid, terrified grimace. Genevieve did not look at the crowd. She ignored the frantic, hissing whispers erupting around her like dry leaves catching fire. She kept her eyes locked on her father. She and Gideon walked slowly down the cleared aisle. Every step they took was synchronized. Gideon walked half a pace behind her shoulder, not leading her, but guarding her flank. He was a massive dark shadow framing her midnight blue. Hastings broke protocol. Instead of waiting for them to approach, he marched down the steps of the dais, intersecting them in the middle of the dance floor. He was vibrating with rage. "What is the meaning of this, Westfall?" Hastings hissed, keeping his voice low, desperate to contain the explosion. "You have broken the terms of our arrangement. Get her out of here immediately." "I am afraid we cannot do that, Lord Hastings," Gideon replied, his tone conversational and loud enough to carry to the front rows of the silent crowd. "My wife received an invitation. We are merely paying our respects to the new royal couple." "She is not welcome here," Hastings snarled, taking a threatening step toward Genevieve. "She is a stain on this house. If you do not drag her out, I will have my footmen throw you both into the street." Gideon didn't raise his voice. He didn't even shift his stance. "If you or your men touch my wife, Hastings, I will beat you to death in front of your guests. Step aside." Hastings froze. He recognized the absolute, chilling certainty in Gideon's voice. Genevieve stepped around her father as if he were nothing more than an inconvenient piece of furniture. She approached the dais. Arabella was breathing fast. The delicate lace at her collar fluttered rapidly against her throat. Lord Henry stepped forward, offering Genevieve a polite if wary nod. "Your Grace, an unexpected pleasure." "Lord Henry," Genevieve said, her voice clear as a silver bell, "congratulations on your betrothal. I felt it was my duty, as Arabella's elder sister, to bring you a wedding gift." "Genevieve, please," Arabella whispered, her eyes darting frantically to the crowd pressing in around them. "Do not do this. You are ill. You are confused." Genevieve smiled. It was a terrifying expression. It held no joy, no warmth, just cold, devastating ruin. "I have never been clearer, sister," Genevieve said. She reached into the small leather reticule hanging from her wrist. The crowd leaned in. Fans stopped fluttering. Even the breathing in the room seemed to pause. Genevieve pulled out the heavy vellum document. She unrolled it slowly, the thick paper crackling in the quiet room. "I brought you a dowry, Lord Henry," Genevieve said, turning to the bewildered young man, "or rather, the accounting of one. 60,000 pounds, the unentailed Hastings fortune. It was meant for me, until I suffered a tragic moral failing." "Genevieve, stop!" Hastings roared, rushing up the steps of the dais. Gideon moved instantly. He grabbed Hastings by the back of his collar and the belt of his trousers, lifting the older man nearly off his feet and threw him backward. Hastings crashed hard onto the polished wood floor, sliding several feet before coming to a halt. Several women shrieked, men shouted. Gideon stood at the base of the dais, his hands loose at his sides, daring anyone else to intervene. No one moved. Genevieve didn't even look back. She handed a separate, smaller sheet of paper to Lord Henry. "What is this?" Henry asked, his brow furrowing as he looked at the columns of ink. "Those are the bank records of Mr. Horace Gadsby, my father's man of business," Genevieve explained, her voice carrying flawlessly to the balcony. "Showing a withdrawal of 8,000 pounds, transferred anonymously to a gambling syndicate in Covent Garden. It paid off the debts of Viscount Thomas Linfield." A collective gasp swept through the room. The name Linfield was the key to the entire scandal. "Lies!" Arabella shrieked. Her pristine facade cracked violently. Her face was flushed, her hands curled into tight, trembling fists. "She is a mad woman. She's trying to ruin my night because she is a jealous, ruined whore." "You should choose your words carefully, Arabella," Genevieve said softly. She held up the heavy vellum. Because Viscount Linfield is not quite as loyal as you believed. He is a coward, and cowards write everything down when they are threatened with prison. Genevieve turned slightly, projecting her voice to the rapt audience. This is a signed, witnessed confession from Thomas Linfield. He details exactly how Lord Hastings bribed him to play the victim. He details how he stood in a tavern room and watched Arabella Hastings tear the bodice of my gown while I lay paralyzed by a drugged glass of lemonade. "No!" Arabella screamed, lunging forward. She tried to snatch the paper from Genevieve's hand. Genevieve merely stepped back, letting Arabella stumble in her heavy gold heels. "He testifies," Genevieve continued, her voice rising in power, drowning out Arabella's sobbing protests, "that my father knew. That my father organized the raid, that they threw me to the wolves to legally strip me of my inheritance and buy this royal betrothal." "Shut her up!" Hastings yelled from the floor, struggling to his feet, his lip bleeding where he had bitten it in the fall. "Henry, do not listen to her. It is a forgery." Lord Henry was not looking at the father. He was staring at the bank draft records in his hand. He was a young man, but he was born into the brutal politics of the royal family. He knew what evidence looked like. He knew the stench of a scandal that could not be contained. He looked at Arabella. She was on her knees, her perfect hair coming undone, weeping hysterically, reaching out for the hem of his coat. "Henry, please," Arabella sobbed. "She hates me. She has always hated me. It isn't true." "Is it, Arabella?" Genevieve asked, dropping her voice to a lethal, intimate whisper. "Look at me. Look me in the eye and swear you didn't hand me the glass. Swear you didn't drag me up those back stairs. If you can swear it, I will burn this confession right now." Arabella looked up. She looked at Genevieve's eyes, the unyielding gray ice. She knew Genevieve had the proof. She knew the game was over. The panic overtook her completely. The entitlement she had been raised on flared into pure, ugly rage. "You didn't deserve it," Arabella screamed, her voice tearing at the edges, echoing off the high ceilings. "You were too old. You were boring. You were going to take the 60,000 and hide in the country, and I would have been left with nothing. I was the one meant for court. I deserved it." The silence in the ballroom returned, absolute and crushing. Arabella clamped her hands over her mouth, realizing a second too late what she had just done. She had confessed, in front of 300 peers of the realm, in front of her royal fiancé. Lord Henry's face turned entirely to stone. He carefully folded the bank records, placed them on the table beside the punch bowl, and took 2 steps back from Arabella. "Lord Hastings," Henry said. His voice was incredibly quiet, but it carried the absolute unforgiving authority of the crown. "Consider this betrothal permanently severed. My solicitor will contact yours regarding the return of the ring. Do not attempt to contact my family again." Henry turned on his heel and walked off the dais. The crowd parted for him instantly. He didn't look back. Arabella collapsed completely, sobbing into her hands on the floor. Hastings stood by the dance floor, completely paralyzed. He looked around the room. The faces staring back at him were not sympathetic. They were filled with disgust. Society loved a scandal, but they abhorred a father who sold his own blood for coin. In the span of 5 minutes, the Hastings family had gone from the pinnacle of London society to absolute pariahs. They were ruined. Utterly, completely ruined. Genevieve stood over her sister for a long moment. She felt no triumph, no joy, only a profound, exhausted emptiness. The venom that had kept her alive for the last 6 months was finally gone. She turned and walked down the steps of the dais. Gideon was waiting for her. He offered his arm. Genevieve took it. They walked back down the aisle, through the sea of silent, staring aristocrats. As they reached the foyer, Hastings finally found his voice. "Genevieve!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He had lost Arabella's match. He had lost his reputation. He only had one lifeline left, the daughter he had thrown away. "Genevieve, wait! We can fix this. You are still a Hastings. You have a duty to this family." Genevieve stopped in the doorway. The cold night air whipped her velvet skirt around her ankles. She turned her head, looking over her shoulder at the broken man standing among the ruins of his own making. "I have no family," Genevieve said. "I am the Duchess of Westfall, and I hope you enjoy the ashes." She stepped out into the night. Gideon followed, shutting the heavy oak doors of the townhouse behind them, cutting off the sound of Arabella's wailing. The carriage ride back to the Westfall townhouse was entirely silent. Genevieve leaned her head against the glass window, watching the blur of the London street lamps. The rain had started again, a slow, freezing drizzle. Her pulse was still hammering in her throat, a residual echo of the adrenaline, but the tension in her shoulders was gone. She felt incredibly light. She felt like she could finally breathe all the way down to the bottom of her lungs. When they arrived at their townhouse, the fire in the drawing room was already lit. A decanter of brandy sat on the side table. Genevieve walked into the room, pulling off her heavy cloak and dropping it over the back of a chair. She didn't ring for her maid. She reached up and began pulling the silver pins from her hair. They clattered onto the mahogany table one by one. Her heavy, dark hair cascaded down her back. Gideon stood by the door, watching her. He had taken off his evening coat and unfastened his cravat. He looked exhausted, the sharp lines of his face softened by the firelight. "Finch sent a messenger to the house while we were out," Gideon said, breaking the silence. He walked over to the side table and poured 2 glasses of brandy. "He finalized the seizure of Linfield's properties. The Viscount is officially bankrupt. He will flee to the continent by morning to avoid the debtor's prison." Genevieve took the glass he offered. "And my father?" "The rumors are already spreading," Gideon said, leaning his hip against the table. "Society is cruel. By tomorrow afternoon, not a single door in Mayfair will open for him. Arabella's reputation is dust. They will likely have to retreat to their smallest country estate and stay there for the rest of their lives. They are finished." Genevieve stared into the amber liquid in her glass. She took a slow sip. The liquor burned a hot, necessary trail down her throat. "It is done then," she said softly. "It is done." Gideon set his glass down. He looked at her, his dark eyes studying the slope of her neck, the relaxed line of her jaw. The contract between them was fulfilled. He had his port. She had her vengeance. "Tomorrow," Gideon began, his voice dropping into a careful, measured cadence, "I will be returning to Westfall Abbey to manage the spring planting, but I have arranged for this townhouse to be put entirely in your name. An allowance of £10,000 a year will be drawn from the estate accounts for your personal use." Genevieve stopped. She looked up at him. "What are you talking about?" "You are free, Genevieve," Gideon said gently. It was the first time he had spoken to her with such absolute softness. "You were forced into a cage by your father and forced into a marriage by me. You survived both. You've proven you do not need anyone to protect you. If you wish to stay in London, rebuild your own life, hold your own courts, you have the funds and the title to do so. I will not confine you to the country." Genevieve stared at him. He was offering her an out, a polite, infinitely wealthy separation. She could be an independent duchess in London, accountable to no one. It was everything a ruined woman could dream of. She set her glass down on the table next to his. The crystal chimed softly in the quiet room. She looked at the man standing before her. For 6 months, he had not asked her for a single thing. He had not pressured her. He had not touched her beyond the polite offerings of his arm. He had simply built a fortress around her, handed her the weapons she needed, and stood by the door to make sure no one stopped her from fighting her way out. He was a cynical man, a hard man. But he was the only man in the world who had ever looked at her and seen something worth saving. Genevieve took a step toward him. Gideon went perfectly still. His eyes tracked her movement. She closed the distance between them. She was close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin, close enough to smell the rain and the faint scent of pipe tobacco on his waistcoat. She reached up, her fingers trembling just slightly, and placed her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. Beneath the fine linen of his shirt, his heartbeat was heavy and fast. He wasn't as calm as he pretended to be. "Do you want me to stay in London, Gideon?" she asked, her voice a low, raspy whisper. Gideon looked down at her. The careful, polite distance he had maintained for half a year cracked. He raised his hand, his fingers hovering for a fraction of a second before he gently cupped her jaw. His thumb brushed over the skin where her father's bruise had once been. "No," Gideon said, his voice thick with an emotion he had buried for a decade. "I want to take my wife home." Genevieve smiled. It wasn't the cold, terrifying smile she had given Arabella. It was real. It reached her eyes, lighting up the stark gray with a sudden, overwhelming warmth. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his shoulder. Gideon let out a long, ragged breath, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her flush against his chest. He held her tightly, burying his face in her dark hair. It was not the desperate clutch of a rescue, but the firm, unyielding hold of an anchor. They stood there in the firelight, the silence of the townhouse wrapping around them. The ghosts of the prancing fox, the cold chapel, and the shattered Hastings family faded into the ashes of the past. Genevieve tilted her head up. Gideon met her halfway. The kiss was not hesitant. It was a collision. It was 6 months of suppressed tension, mutual respect, and a slow-burning, undeniable fire breaking loose. It tasted of brandy, relief, and absolute certainty. When they finally broke apart, breathing heavily, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. "My carriage leaves for Westfall at dawn," he murmured, his hands resting on her waist. "I will be in it," Genevieve replied. She stepped back, taking his hand and weaving her fingers through his. She looked toward the stairs leading to the bedchambers. She squeezed his hand. "And Gideon," she said softly. "Yes?" "I don't think we need the carpenter anymore. You can take the lock off my door." If you loved watching Genevieve burn high society to the ground and find true love with the Duke who armed her, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another dramatic historical romance story. What was your favorite moment? Did Arabella get exactly what she deserved, or did Lord Henry let her off too easy? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Share this video with your fellow romance readers who love a good revenge plot. And I'll see you in the next story.